So we have a different mindset on how to work, how our manager should be and everything. And then when you become actual and manager, what's the change of perspective?
The mindset is about absorbing as much as you can. And when you become a manager, it becomes...
So you have hired multiple people. So when you hire someone, what do you look at them?
Yeah, I think the main impression comes from the resume. That's like the first screening because, a lot of open roles, but also like tons of applications for those roles. I'm looking at folks who have done, can demonstrate.
How do you think the job market will be this year? Do you think it will get better? Or that's everyone's question. How 2020 is gonna be after like Trump's taking and everything?
I think it's really tough to say. I do think opportunities continue to open up. We just have to put in the legwork, find them, different industries. It's also the timing of the year. I think even in a challenging environment, it actually creates more opportunities for...
So, welcome to Deep Diving with Samyak Jain. Today we have Nantha Rajendran with us, and he was an associate director at Wayfair for partner operations team, and currently he's working at BJ's Wholesale Club and leading operations and supply chain strategy initiative. So, first of all, thank you for coming up on this podcast and sharing your insights with the people out there who are looking out for jobs in supply chain, who are newcomers to this industry, or who have like 2-3 years of experience and looking to change roles. So, thank you so much for coming and sharing your insights.
Thank you for having me, and happy to be on. And I was in everyone's shoes as well, looking for supply chain roles, and I've had to do that a couple of times in my career. So happy to provide and share about my journey, and if it's going to be helpful to anyone.
Sure. Yeah. So let's start with like a brief introduction about you and how you've reached here. So can you just please tell like about you did your engineering to you are right now at BJ's Whole Club. So how was your whole journey and how you pivoted through different times and get into this role right now?
Yeah, so I studied electrical engineering
Yeah.
at University of Malaya in Malaysia, where my family is from. And my first job after graduation, I went to work for Toshiba in Japan. They were hiring engineers from Southeast Asia and South Asia as part of the global recruitment program. I'm hiring engineers to work on expanding Toshiba's business units globally. So they gave us the first 6 months of intensive language training. So we learned Japanese, and then we were posted to different business units focused on expanding Toshiba's business overseas. And I was part of the infrastructure business, specifically working on power transmission and distribution technologies, supplying it to utilities, right? Like, so if you think about anything that goes into a substation, those are the type of equipment that I worked on. My role was essentially almost like a product manager role. I was in between the factories and the customers, working on developing new markets, identifying what the market needs for new technologies, and then scaling it. I got to do a lot of work in like clean tech, renewables, smart grids during that time. And it was really good exposure to like global business. Ultimately, I wanted to move into something a little bit more consumer facing and a little more fast paced than infrastructure. So I spent almost 7 years in Japan with Toshiba, and then decided to go to business school to make that pivot to more consumer facing industries. So I went to University of Michigan, Ross School of Business to get my MBA. And there I focused on operations and strategy. Ross has a program through the Tauber Institute for Global Operations, where you can sort of, while doing your MBA, also have like a specialization in supply chain and operations. So that's what I wanted to. I did a lot of work at Toshiba that was supply chain and ops related. I wanted to sort of formalize that during my MBA. So on top of my MBA, I also was a fellow at the Tauber Institute. And I graduated from my MBA and went into management consulting for a couple of years, mostly working on operation strategy projects across different industries, retail, manufacturing, and utilities. Did that for a couple of years, really got to hone my analytical skills and exposure to different industries and work on the strategy side of supply chain and operations before I joined Wayfair. So I was able to do that, get back into industry in a more operations focused role based on the 2 years of like consulting experience that I had. At Wayfair, I was leading teams that were supplier facing. They were organized by category. We did end-to-end supply chain management for suppliers. And it was an interesting time because we had to navigate the pandemic, all the supply chain challenges that came through it. So it was a lot of learning. Ultimately, got to do end-to-end work. And then I did some specialized work focused on reducing incidents and returns within the supply chain, working with Wayfair suppliers. And then for the last almost year now, I've been with BJ's Wholesale Club. I pivoted more towards like physical grocery retail supply chains, which I had an interest in. So I've been working on more, strategic ops projects focused on, BJ's Wholesale Club again, supply chain like end to end. BJ's has the physical stores, we call them clubs, but also focused on initiatives across transportation, distribution, and recently planning and allocation as well.
Thanks for sharing. It's a very like journey from coming from studying in Malaysia to going to Japan, then coming to US and doing a master's MBA. And so it's a thanks for sharing all of those with us. So now I have one question, which like I think many people like when people are joining. It's like when you joined first time in a Toshiba as an employee. So we have a different mindset on how to work, how our manager should be, and everything. And then when you become actual and manager, what's the change of perspective on like how those things should work?
I think when you're starting out, you should be open, like really have an open mind in terms of like absorbing things
Yeah.
and making yourself available, right? Like to, when I started, one of the things I would think about is like no task is beneath you. Like, everything is a learning opportunity. And I would do things like offer to help, format PowerPoint decks and like even get printouts for my boss because I know that I was pulled in to help a lot with translation of documents. And even though it's not like the most interesting work, I took it on because I felt like when I'm translating documents, I'm actually learning about what's in those documents, being prepared for like, either business presentations or different projects that are going on. So I think the mindset is about absorbing as much as you can and then, seeking out those new opportunities to learn. And when you become a manager, it becomes, you sort of remember the journey that you went on and you realize like you need to create those opportunities for the people that work for you. Like, are you giving them enough exposure? Are you pulling them in to different initiatives? Are you doing the coaching and, giving people like stretch goals and responsibilities? I had one of my first managers when I joined Toshiba in Japan. He would take me to meetings that with clients, with other stakeholders, and just to give me that exposure. And he would have only one rule. He'd say, I'm going to take you to these meetings, but I don't want you to be silent. Like the rule is you have to ask at least one question during the meeting, right? And that's how he brought me to those meetings. And that would force me to pay attention during the meetings to ask an intelligent question. But at the same time, like, it keeps me on my toes and I'm like listening to what's happening. Sometimes the conversations when I was starting out, they were fully in Japanese. So I have to like really concentrate, some language training, but it was also, it takes time to follow. I think those are some of the things that I took with me. Like when I became a manager, like I tried to create those opportunities for the people on my teams as well.
Yeah, I think that's true. Like, because like if for my perspective also, like as I'm a new joinee, like I'm just working for in US for like 2 years now. So definitely it feels like, hey, I should get this support from a manager. I should get this from a team or like this is my expectation. But when you become a person who you are expecting like what to get from, it's totally different. So thanks for sharing that. So my next question is related to like, so as you become a manager and you become a director and now you're working in BJ's, right? So you have hired multiple people in supply chain roles. So when you hire someone, what do you look at them? Like what do you look in resume or like do you like go and look at their LinkedIn or like how do you like pass them for the first interview to get them into the first interview?
Yeah, I think the main impression comes from the resume. So that's like the first screening. Because even when we were hiring at one point at Wayfair, we were really expanding the team. So we had, a lot of open roles, but also like tons of applications for those roles. And we had a pipeline almost at different levels. And you'd have to go through like, you'd have like 100 resumes sometimes for one role. And you really have to, go through and try to narrow down the list of candidates that you want the recruiter to screen. And then, after that, like invite for interviews. So I think like the first impression comes from the resume, like a quick scan of like 1 to 2 minutes per resume. And I think the things that you look for, one, you're looking for, because you spend like such a short time on each one, you're looking for like a concise, to the point, bullets in your resume that focus on like, what you did, what were the results, and what was your contribution. So I'm looking at folks who have done, can demonstrate the ownership of things that they're given. That could be school projects, that could be like internships where they took something and they worked with it, see the results that they drove, and also like have they been exposed to like different types of work and different types of thinking. It really depends on the role as well, but the roles we were hiring for at Wayfair, for example, it included supplier management. It needed people who were good with data and analytics. It needed a little bit of like technical skills as well, along with people management skills. So I'm looking for those things depending on the role. Like, do those boxes check? Like, we have a list of roles and responsibilities. Obviously, like some relevant industry experience is sometimes helpful. If you're looking at, if you're working for Wayfair, it's like, is it e-commerce experience? Have they worked in like international supply chain projects, or like have they taken, if it's fresh graduates, have they taken the courses? I think one of the things I look for is like basic skills like Excel and PowerPoint, not so much on like certifications, because I feel like a lot of the things you learn on the job and you can pick up. But if you have like the basic skills of like, analyzing data, you're competent with Excel, and like you could tell a good story by putting that into PowerPoint, I think that works. So the first impression like comes from those things.
Understood. And like what, so definitely I think Excel is like one of the key tool in supply chain. Like only 60% of
Mhm.
50% of the work is done only in Excel. Rest is like ERP and everything. So definitely I think Excel is something like people should know when they are going into it, like if they are freshers too. If when you see a resume, what, so sometimes you might see a resume where there are some errors or something. So what do you see like which throws you off when you see any resume? Like, hey, this resume don't looks good. Do you also look at like how if they are making any mistakes in, for example, in spellings, formatting issues? Because we see many people doing that in resume. So how does that throws off?
Yeah, it definitely, especially when you're comparing multiple resumes,
Yeah.
those mistakes do like jump out at you, right? And
Yeah.
and I think things that you could fix, especially with all the tools that people have today to build
Correct.
resumes. I think like those are things that you should definitely pay some attention to, because
Correct.
that's the other thing. Like one of the things in supply chain and data, like you need attention to detail. So
Yeah.
if you have a resume like that, like it gives a
Yeah.
wrong impression on like this person didn't catch this. Like and this is they should have reread it multiple times just to make sure that everything checks out. Another thing I feel like concise resume, especially for people earlier in their career, everything should
Yeah.
fit in one page.
Yeah.
It shouldn't go more than one page because people aren't spending that much time. And if it's especially if you're starting out in your career, you can definitely fit into one page. And you should minimize white space in between. So each line, this is something that was drilled into me. Like I didn't have a resume like that until I went to business school, where you get a lot of
Correct.
coaching on how to use the tools, and you
Yeah.
get peer reviewers and career coaches who help review your resumes. And one of the feedback I'd get is like eliminate white space, like make each line, maximize each line so that it
True.
looks like a really concise but also like fully packed resume.
Yeah, I think it's definitely because like how we have resume structure in Southeast Asia or like India side of it, it's
Mm-hmm.
totally different how its resume structure is in US. Because when I
Right.
prepared my resume, it was totally different. We sometimes they ask us to have a photo also in a resume in back in
Mm-hmm.
India. So I think
Yeah.
it's definitely having those tools that you can leverage from your universities. So when you look at someone's profile and when you want to interview, do you also look if they submit cover letter or not? So like how important is cover letter part?
I go back and forth on this, like, and something that when I apply for jobs, when I've applied for jobs in the past, like, I make it a point to submit a cover letter because I think in my mind that sometimes it sets, if there's multiple resumes with people who have similar skill sets,
Yeah.
the cover letter could be the difference maker. But at the same time, I've heard because people spend such little time like screening resumes, they don't have time to open cover letters. My personal feeling is like we shouldn't need cover letters, but if
Yeah.
a company is asking for it, I think you should take the time to do it, especially
Yeah.
if you really want to, set yourself apart. Put together a cover letter that speaks specifically to why you're interested in that
True.
job and how your skill sets match
Yeah.
the responsibilities required for that role. It doesn't have to be really long, but I think it's at least more personalized and tells your story, gives a little bit more context to your resume. And I don't think
Yeah.
it can hurt. It's one of those
Definitely,
things
it won't
where
hurt.
it won't hurt, but it takes additional time. Might end up not getting opened or read at all.
Yeah.
But if the recruiter or the hiring manager is someone who wants to read a cover letter and they don't see one, it could be the difference maker when you're considering like multiple resumes.
Okay, yeah, I think so because like so from my experience, what I used to do was the companies which are like my dream companies, like if I want to go into Tesla or Google or
Mm-hmm.
someone like Amazon, like big supply chain companies, then I will put on I used to put effort to put my cover letter in the system or where there is necessary, like you can't skip
Yep.
this step. But like
Right.
for companies, because when I used to apply, it was mostly like apply 40, 50 roles a day, 30 roles a day. It
Mm-hmm.
becomes very hard to customize your cover letter every time for every
Right.
role.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's where like use good judgment. Like you said,
Yeah.
maybe don't write a cover letter for every single application, especially some of the ones that are like long shots. You just want to drop a
Yeah.
resume and forget about it.
Yeah.
You don't need to spend time. I think the even bigger mistake is when you try to drop a cover letter for each role and you're applying to 40 jobs. Sometimes you make a
Put a
mistake and it's
change,
like
forgot to change the company name.
exactly. And
Yeah.
that will end up backfiring.
Yeah, I think yeah. So as we are talking about this, so one of the question that I get mostly is that we are fresher in supply chain, and right now every job in supply chain needs 2 to 3 years of experience. How do we do? How do we get that?
I think some of it is framing, right? Like, supply chain and operations is like a really broad field. There's a lot of things that could be classified as supply chain or operations. I would take a really close look at all the experiences that people have had. Either it's through internships or like school projects. And can you identify like the things that are relevant to supply chain? And, you might have to tweak your resume or like put it that way. I think that's one way to approach it. Like it's about framing like your experiences
Yeah.
in a way that makes sense for that role and why you'd be a good fit. The other thing that I've done from time to time is like look for opportunities with like nonprofits or organizations that might need additional support for.
Okay.
It might not have to be like core supply chain role. It could be like a data analysis, some sort of support that they need, and like reach out to those orgs and, offer
Yeah.
up your time and say like, I'm willing to partner, and it be a win-win. Like if you need help, I need some experience and
Experience.
exposure to like real world problems and practical experience in supply chain. And, that could be an option for
Yeah.
folks who like don't have it. But I'm with you. I also don't think like, entry level roles should be entry level roles and
Yeah.
shouldn't have like 2 to 3 years
Yeah.
experience listed there. But a lot of folks like have a master's degree and they've specialized in like supply chain. And I
Yeah.
think sometimes that additional education component could be a stand-in for like 1 to 2 years experience, right?
Correct.
I also think like depending on the way a role is written, don't let that deter you. If you don't have, if it reads like an entry level role, go ahead and apply. Like don't let that one thing where it says like 2 to 3 years experience deter you, because I think sometimes I feel like companies recycle some of those job postings as well, and that becomes like a 2 to 3 year standard. But I've seen that in practice, like they would be open to someone who's coming out of college.
Correct, yeah. And I think, yeah, definitely, like as you said, like the NGO part is something that people can do, like virtual kind of work, virtual internship, like where you don't have to be in person working there.
Mm-hmm.
And you can do like a pro bono thing, which can help you in your resume and which can help them in their organization. So,
Right.
like, if you don't get a like internship, because I think right now it's very getting hard getting those internships and co-op in supply chain
Mm-hmm.
also, because
Yeah.
because of so much of high cohort coming up every year right now,
Right.
and the job market is not that much of high. And when like during the 2021 or 2022 time when we see
Mm-hmm.
fast that, so I think that's definitely true. So as you mentioned, like we could do like projects and those like work with NGOs. In those times, those certifications also help when you don't have that much of experience.
I think I want to be careful here because I don't want people to like chase certifications for the sake of
Correct.
it. Because I really think the value comes from getting that work experience and doing the certifications that are relevant to your specific role, either through your company or like after you get a job, like focusing on the ones that actually are
Matter.
helpful. But I think if you do want to augment your resume, there's a couple of things that I could think of, like, from a continuous improvement standpoint, that's even if you don't use that tool for everything, I think that the way to think about that approach to problem solving is helpful. So
True.
Lean Six Sigma is one that,
Yeah.
helps you develop that sort of thinking. But as long as you realize that it's not a magic wand that you should apply to every single problem,
Correct.
it's more of like a way of thinking that you should use, and you could leverage those tools. I think like core supply chain, CSCP, like
Epic certifications.
yes, I think those are definitely relevant. It's a plus for folks that have it. And I know certain companies, when they're looking for like specific analyst roles,
They
they'll
put
list it
Epic
in the
certified.
recommendations that APIC
Yeah.
certified is a preferred qualification, for example.
Correct.
So I think those two, Lean Six Sigma and APIX, would be good. PMP is another one that's pretty general. But I think if you're coming out of like grad school, I feel like that's the courses that you did and the program, for me as a hiring manager, that'd be a better indicator than like some of the standardized certifications. But again, going back to like the cover letter argument, like these are things that won't hurt, but don't overdo it and just like chase certifications. And you put the things that you do on like LinkedIn certifications on your resume, like that's tends to dilute sometimes like the value of
Correct.
some of the certifications.
Yeah, I think with amount of certification that are available right now with Coursera IDX, like people tend to put every certifications like with which don't have that much of impact, definitely affects
Mm-hmm.
that. And like certifications like Epic, they're very
Yes.
costly.
Yeah.
So and like people already having on loan on education and everything, that putting
Mm-hmm.
like apart $3,000-4,000 for that Epic
Right.
certification is also a big chunk. So what I usually suggest people is that get some Lean Six Sigma, because that's a pretty cheaper, I
Right.
believe, in comparison, but get it from good institutions, not from,
Right.
because their Six Sigma green belt is getting like many certifications are out there right now who is giving these certifications, but
Yeah.
only valuable are a couple of institutions who give them very in a good manner.
Yeah.
So
And at Apex, I would almost encourage people to work with their companies. Like once they get
yeah,
hired, like talk to your manager to see if there's any support that the company can give you to pursue some of these,
yeah,
especially if it's relevant to your role. I think a lot of companies have that provision where they can,
yeah,
have some
like
like tuition reimbursement and stuff.
$3,000-4,000 a year or something they put aside for like
Yeah.
personal development of their employee per year, I believe,
Correct.
something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as you've done like several interviews and several people, like you've interviewed like over 1,500 people for sure in last couple of years. So what mistakes you see when people interview? Like what mistakes they tend to do much more, like many times you've seen those?
I think a common one is not giving like concise answers. Have you heard of like the STAR method, right? Like situation,
Correct.
action,
Yeah.
result. So I think sticking to those answers, that's a very common pitfall that I see where folks are not tying things back to like the result. And after after a certain point, you should sort of catch yourself if you see that you're like going on and on with an answer,
Yeah.
and watch the body language of the interviewer. Are they losing interest, or are they trying to like, get you to move on to the next question? So I think that's a common one. So practicing like concise answers, I would say like, 1 to 2 minutes max. And then if the interviewer has follow-up questions, they can ask that. But I think the one pitfall is like not sort of tying your answer back to the result. Second one is like focusing on what was your contribution especially with the behavioral.
Yeah.
Like I used to do this a lot too, but I think a lot of folks from Asian background, like we tend to use and talk about the team. But I think during an interview, you should focus on like what was your contribution specifically to it. And then I think another one is don't feel the need to like right away jump into an answer. If you need to think about it, especially if it's more of like a quantitative question, like ask for time. Like say, can I take 30 seconds to just like structure my thoughts and get back to you? And no one's going to say no unless they say like, no, don't worry about like calculation. Let's have a conversation. Otherwise, I think you should always ask for time. So just being composed and having good examples to demonstrate your like behavioral situations, I think can help with some of those things, like, the rambling answer and like focusing on like your contribution.
Definitely. I think, we missed like sometimes in like we got so much in depth in telling the whole story, we forgot to get to the result part of our story. So
Yeah.
that thanks for sharing that particular thought. So like what was different types of like basically how a person can identify which questions I should prepare more when I want to go in supply chain, like how they anticipate the questions before interview.
Yeah, there's a like list of behavioral questions that always come up, right? And
Yeah.
I think it really depends on the company. With Wayfair, for example, like you had like the people principles, and the questions would always be tied to those specific ones. So you, depending on the company you're applying for, look for what that company's like values are, principles, and the questions will always be tied to that. With Amazon, like they have like their principles, right? And the questions would always like customer obsessed and things like that. You have to like prepare questions, your answers based off of like those type of questions and situations. Again, I think it's more about the delivery as well. Always have like a headline, like set the tone, like situation where you did this, and then you can go into the subheader, like the explanation. But some common questions that would always come up is, especially for analyst roles, like time when you've used data to solve a problem, or time when you made a mistake with an analysis and how you recovered from it. I think making a mistake and how you recovered from it is like a very common question that always comes up. It shows like how that person, deals with failure, like deals with
Takes ownership of the thing.
yeah, and how they like think critically as well.
Yeah.
When you had a difference of opinion with a coworker, how you convinced them, or how you like closed ranks and like went forward. That's a good one. Conflict resolution, especially in roles that have a little bit more interaction with like stakeholders and stuff. But solving problems and like using data, that used to come up, especially for analyst roles. Always like talk about a time where you used data to solve a problem, or like you noticed a mistake, or you made a mistake. I think those things keep coming up.
Yeah, I think like those behavioral questions, like definitely those principles, and then I like what I like how I used to prepare was like going through those job descriptions and putting WH words in front of each line. So, for example, where have I done this task? When I have done this task? What was the impact of this task? And put like those WH words in front of each job descriptions.
Right.
Also, like because those things and then adding those principles thing, I think that sums up like 90%, 95% of your questions will come up around that itself.
Yeah, and sometimes like you could have the same situation for different questions, right? And it might not be the exact same wording of a question,
Correct.
but you could actually like your answer can actually fit that box.
Fit that box. And I think, and one thing also, like people tend to adjust like single example for multiple questions. So they should have like different examples out there.
You can have the same example for different questions, but when you're preparing. But if during the interview you use the same example more than once, sometimes like you would have to ask, like, can you give me a different example? But it could be from the same role, right? Like at this X company when I was doing this, and sometimes if the question is different, right? Like if you solved a problem, like an interesting problem using data, and then another question comes up, tell me about a time where you had a conflict with or like disagreed with your coworker. It could be from that example, right? You said, I talked about that example, but don't
Different
repeat the same
aspect of
things.
it.
Give the different aspect of it. That's right.
And definitely, because they don't want to hear the same result again and again. So definitely that's So moving on to like, so this is about like behavioral questions we had. Now like there are case study rounds of questions also comes up in supply chain. So like how a person should prepare, where shared like how they should prepare for it and how they should, like when they get a question in an interview, how they should structure their answers.
Yeah, I think case questions are really interesting, especially for, like you said, entry level roles.
Yeah.
Where, there's not as much to draw off of someone's work experience. The case really comes into play about how they approach problems. Are they good, on their feet, and are they good with numbers? Is the other one. So I would practice like different scenarios. There's a lot of example cases online that you can find, and some companies will like give you an example of what their case is like, or you could go online and look for others who've like interviewed with that company and what type of cases that you get.
Like Glassdoor or something they can.
Yeah. So I think preparing for that is just a lot of prep, like doing different types of case interviews. Like find a buddy. When I was recruiting for consulting, like you did a lot of like case interviews as prep,
Yeah.
and you find a buddy and you give each other cases, and you have like a case book. Universities sometimes, like the consulting club and all, will have these example cases that you could draw on and practice those, and practice like how you would approach it. Like, is it an open-ended case where you have to like, develop a framework and then work through it, asking different questions to get more data and then working through it? Or is it more of like interviewer puts up a table and says, here's the situation, here are the numbers? That's more structured and you can work through. And the Wayfair cases were more like that, as you know. It's like different scenarios. Just be comfortable with like mental math and like quick math.
Yeah.
I think practicing those type of questions helps. It's okay to make a mistake if it's like, but if you like quickly catch it and recover from it. But, multiple like math mistakes on a case are also like a red flag for an analyst. So you want to make sure like, you can do like quick back of the table math. Always look for like percent increase or like rate change. Look at trends. And that's like, bread and butter, getting the numbers right. But I would also focus on like deriving insights from those numbers. Like, what do you see? Like, you can get, like most people can do math. If they practice, they'll do math. But like, what do you see from that data? What is this telling you? And if someone gives you like a set of data, you should be able to like see the trend, identify like where the opportunity area is, and come up with recommendations. I think tying those dots is the most important thing. The table stakes are like getting your math right and the frameworks, but after that it's more about practice where it comes. And I think that comes from applying what you learn in class with like business concepts and supply chain concepts, tying it back, not just being able to do the math, but how does this tie to the business outcome? What
Like
metrics
getting
would
the story out of those numbers when you do calculations, because plus minus multiply divide, where people can do those basic, but how you will get those calculations into a story that will support the business needs, basically.
Correct.
That.
Exactly.
Yeah. So thanks for sharing that. So moving on to like next part of the section, which is more on like basically the resume section, which is like skills, where people tends to like what skills they should have in their resume in a supply chain role. Like it could be like hard skills, like technical skills, and soft skills. Like what skills should be a good one for supply chain?
Yeah, I think again, supply chain is so broad that I hesitate to like name like a specific list of things that you need. But going back to like you should be really good with Excel. I think Excel, pivot tables, writing different formulas, putting together like simple models. That should be
basic.
Like, basic. That's the expectation. Like you're comfortable with numbers. SQL is another one. I feel a lot of like for pulling data. Right? Excel is more for like collating that data, summarizing it. But being able to write SQL queries is a huge plus, especially for a lot of folks who they might have done it in the past, but once they become managers, like they're not writing as many queries to pull the data. They have people on their team to do it for them. And if someone comes in and is able to write queries to pull the data quickly for you, I think that's like a huge plus. And I think SQL is something that is a lot of companies use in different forms, whether it's like Google BigQuery or MySQL and things like that. Principles are the same, and like the language is pretty similar. So Excel and SQL. An added skill, like if you ask me, like I've been using PowerPoint for a long time, and like taking those insights from Excel, taking the data from SQL, and then being able to package it into a presentation that you can deliver, answering like the so what, or like what are the takeaways? Because a lot of times, like when you're presenting findings to leadership, you're not pulling up a full Excel sheet and going through it. You're taking a summary of that and putting it on a PowerPoint slide and like telling a story through that, right? So for me, I think SQL, Excel, PowerPoint.
And like what about like tools like ERP, like SAP side of it, and like visualization like Power BI or Tableau?
I mean, Tableau is a big plus. I think some sort of visualization is definitely useful as well. Tableau is good. Power BI, again, it depends on the company, what they're using too. So I wouldn't like focus on any one, but if you have like, I think Tableau is a pretty good skill to have as well, being able to like present data in like, compelling way. ERPs, again, depends on the company. Like you could try to learn SAP or Oracle, but like the company might not be using it. Those are things you would pick up more like once you've joined the company, depending on the tool that they're using. Like you should get familiar with that data warehouse and those reports that each company has. I wouldn't spend too much time trying to learn an ERP system before you join a company.
So like as as you specified, like there are like different tools for different type of supply chain roles. That's why we can't like say like this tool is needed to success in supply chain, because there are different
Hmm.
supply chain roles.
Right.
So like if a person who is a newcomer, how he or she can understand like which supply chain role would be a good fit for him, or like how he or she can identify that.
I would think about where someone's interest is, but for more like entry level people who are earlier in their career, I would encourage you to like, unless you have a conviction that you're 100% sure this is exactly what I want to do, I would say keep an open mind. Roles evolve, and like once you're in a company, you can see that there's different types of roles. It's hard to tell from the outside exactly this is what you'll be doing. And if you read some of the roles and responsibilities, they're pretty broad because they want to bring in folks and have them do different things. So I think identify where your interest is. Is it a specific industry? But if you're like thinking about broad buckets, is it is it on the planning side? Is it on the sourcing side? Is it like, are you want to focus on transportation and logistics specifically? Are you focused on more on like distribution and warehouses? Do you want to be in the field and work in, actual like distribution centers and warehouses and like come up on that way? Or do you want to be more of like an analyst based out of head office, the corporate office, working on this? I focus more on like the broader buckets versus like the exact roles,
Yeah.
because those tend to evolve, especially earlier in your
Correct.
career.
As you're moving towards like the end of this podcast, I will just ask like one couple of questions,
Mm-hmm.
which will be very quick. So, what's one piece of advice would you give people who are just starting out? Like, if you are to look back at yourself and see like this is what should I have done, or like what would be that?
That's a great question. I think keeping an open mind while figuring out like what excites you and what energizes you and focusing on that. I think, I started as an electrical engineer. I don't do any electrical engineering these days, right? So
Correct.
sort of like pivoted into the roles that I'm in now. And I think if anything, I would have been a little bit more deliberate in making those choices that get me to where I am today, like focusing on those roles. I don't know if I would have changed anything about my journey, but I think saying no sometimes to certain opportunities when you're earlier in your career, like you tend to jump at everything, right? Especially in a tough job market and stuff, you can't help it sometimes. But I think being a little bit more selective in, is that actually what I want to do? Is that something that I'll be good at? And sometimes the answer is no, but is that a stepping stone to something else further down the road? Take all those things into consideration when you're making your choice. Sometimes less is more in terms of like what you take on. I think being
Yeah.
more selective and deliberate, but starting out with like an open mind, hearing all the perspective, but then being a little bit more selective when you make your decision, I think is helpful, and it's probably something I would have done a better job at if I could go back in time.
Yeah, I think that's definitely like the open mind thing is something that will open lots of future opportunities, and saying no at the right time is also a very crucial thing. So
Mhm.
thank you for sharing that. Just one last question. It will be like, how do you think the job market will be this year? Do you think it will get better? Because that's everyone's question. How 2025 is gonna be after like Trump's taking and everything.
It's really tough to say. I think the economy is in like a weird spot where it feels like it's not doing so well, but at the same time, all the markers and
Yeah.
inflation is coming down. Certain industries, like companies, continue to hire. Certain jobs have dried up. So I think it's really tough to say. I do think opportunities continue to open up. You just have to put in the legwork to find them. Different industries. It's also the timing of the year now with budgets and everything, where companies are hiring. So I think there is some optimism in the industry, and overall, like with supply chain, it's becoming more of a focus. There's so many things going on too, right? It's not just like we continue to grow, but there are challenges that might come up that need to be addressed. And one example would be tariffs. Like if new tariffs come in, it's a huge impact on supply chain, where people have to think about like, do you source from different countries? Can you have any tariff mitigation programs? Do you near shoring,
Yeah.
bring production and stuff like onshore? Do you source from like different companies and things like that? And like what that does to your logistics cost and your lead times. I think even in a challenging environment, it actually creates more opportunities
Yeah.
for
Supply chain.
people, for
Yeah.
supply chain folks, because those are challenges that need to be overcome anyway. So, I'm optimistic about the industry and like the opportunities that continue to open up.
Thank you so much for sharing all those insights. It's been, I think, 45 minutes, and it's a very good, interesting way to understand like how, from like a director manager, you have been manager perspective, how you look at like when you hire for someone. So it's definitely a different perspective from what people who gets hired and the people
Mhm.
who actually hire shares. So thank you so much for sharing all those with us today.
Thank you for having me, and good luck with everything.